The church bells of St. Mary's Cathedral rang out across the small town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, their bronze voices carrying news of joy to anyone within miles who cared to listen. It was the kind of perfect September afternoon that made people believe in happy endings. Golden sunlight streaming through stained glass windows, a gentle breeze rustling the maple trees that lined the church grounds, and the kind of crisp air that promised autumn was coming, but hadn't quite arrived yet. Inside the cathedral, 200 guests sat in polished wooden pews, their faces turned toward the altar, where a young woman in white stood beside a man in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. The bride was radiant, her dark hair swept up in an elegant chignon, her smile bright enough to power the entire town. The groom looked like he'd won the lottery, which in a way he had. Nobody noticed the man who slipped in through the back doors just as the ceremony began. He was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of too much sun and not enough sleep. His suit was clean but not expensive, the kind you could buy off the rack at a department store if you needed something respectable in a hurry. His dark hair was shorter than military regulation, but longer than he'd worn it in years, and his eyes, grey-green like storm clouds, swept the congregation with the automatic awareness of someone who'd learned to catalogue exits and potential threats without thinking about it. Michael "Mick" Sullivan hadn't been invited to this wedding. In fact, he was probably the last person on earth the bride expected to see on what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. But he wasn't here to cause trouble, wasn't here to object when the minister asked if anyone had reason these two shouldn't be wed. He was here because of a promise he'd made to a dying man in a desert halfway around the world, a promise that had taken him 3 years to find the courage to keep. The bride's name was Emma Catherine Morrison, though in about 10 minutes she'd be Emma Catherine Walsh. Mick had known her as Emma Morrison for exactly 18 months, from the time she was 19 until she turned 21, during what felt like the longest and shortest period of his life. They'd been engaged once, back when the world was different, and he was different, and the future seemed like something you could plan for instead of something that happened to you while you were busy making other plans. That was before Iraq, before the roadside bomb that had taken his best friend's life and left Mick with scars that went deeper than the ones you could see, before he'd realized that some people were meant to come home from war and some people weren't, and that sometimes the ones who came home carried so much darkness with them that they couldn't risk spreading it to the people they loved most. Emma had tried to understand. God knows she'd tried. She'd waited for him through his deployment, had written letters every day, and sent care packages filled with homemade cookies and photographs of home. She'd been there at the airport when his unit returned, had thrown her arms around him like she could hold him together through sheer force of will. She'd sat beside him through the nightmares, had held him when he woke up screaming, had never once complained when he'd stare off into space in the middle of conversations, lost in memories of sand and blood and the sound of his best friend's voice calling his name. But love, Mick had learned, wasn't always enough. Sometimes love meant letting go. Sometimes love meant walking away before you destroyed the thing you were trying to protect. He'd broken up with Emma on a Tuesday in March, 3 months after he'd come home. He'd done it badly, cruelly, because he'd known that if he gave her any hope, any opening, she'd fight for them. And Emma Morrison was the kind of woman who, when she fought for something, usually won. So he'd told her he didn't love her anymore, that the war had changed him, that he needed space to figure out who he was now. He'd watched her face crumble, had seen the exact moment her heart broke, and had hated himself more than he'd ever hated anything in his life. But he'd also known it was the right thing to do, because Emma deserved someone who could give her a future without shadows, someone who could sleep through the night without waking up in a cold sweat, someone who could be present in their own life instead of constantly fighting battles that had ended years ago. She'd moved on eventually. It had taken her 2 years, but she'd moved on. She'd finished college, had gotten a job teaching elementary school, had met a good man named David Walsh who worked as an accountant and coached Little League baseball on weekends, and had never seen anything more violent than a heated argument over a restaurant bill. David was everything Mick wasn't: stable, predictable, safe. David could promise Emma a white picket fence and 2.5 children and a retirement plan, and he could deliver on those promises because he'd never had to learn that the world was a place where good people died for no reason and promises got broken by forces beyond anyone's control. Mick should have been happy for her. He was happy for her. in the way you can be happy for someone while simultaneously feeling like your chest is being crushed in a vice. Emma deserved happiness, deserved love, deserved all the things he'd never been able to give her. The fact that it hurt to see her getting those things from someone else was his problem, not hers. But he wasn't here because of his own feelings. He was here because of Tommy. Thomas Michael Morrison, Tommy to his friends, Corporal Morrison to the army, had been Emma's older brother and Mick's best friend since they were 12 years old. They'd grown up 3 houses apart on Elm Street, had played baseball in the same little league, had gotten detention together for setting off fireworks behind the school gymnasium, had double-dated to senior prom, and gotten spectacularly drunk afterward in Tommy's parents' basement. When they'd enlisted together right after high school, it had seemed like the natural next step in a friendship that had defined both their lives. They'd gone through basic training together, had been assigned to the same unit through what their drill sergeant had called dumb luck, but what they'd known was destiny. They'd deployed to Iraq together, had watched each other's backs through convoy runs and house-to-house searches and the 1,000 small moments of terror that made up a combat deployment. Tommy had been the better soldier, more disciplined, more focused, better at following orders without question. But Mick had been the better survivor, more paranoid, more willing to trust his instincts when something felt wrong. It was a combination that had kept them both alive through 13 months of patrols and firefights and the constant grinding stress of never knowing which day might be your last, until the day it was. They'd been on a routine patrol through a neighborhood in Baghdad that intelligence had cleared as relatively safe. The kind of mission that should have been a walk in the park, if parks had snipers and improvised explosive devices, and children who might be carrying grenades instead of toys. Mick had been driving the lead Humvee, Tommy riding shotgun, when the world exploded around them. The IED had been buried under a pile of rubble that looked like every other pile of rubble in a city that had seen too much war. Mick never saw it, never had any warning beyond the split-second instinct that made him jerk the steering wheel to the right, just as the device detonated. The explosion lifted their vehicle off the ground and slammed it back down again, turning the world into a chaos of twisted metal and smoke, and the high-pitched ringing that meant his eardrums had probably burst. When the smoke cleared, Mick found himself hanging upside down in his seat harness, blood running down his face from a gash on his forehead. His left arm was broken, he could tell that much, and something was wrong with his ribs. But he was alive, and that was more than he'd expected when he'd felt the Humvee leave the ground. Tommy wasn't as lucky. The explosion had caved in the passenger side of the vehicle, and Tommy was trapped under a piece of the roof that had folded down like origami. His legs were pinned, and there was blood, too much blood, pooling beneath him. But his eyes were open, and when he saw Mick looking at him, he managed a weak smile. "Well," Tommy said, his voice barely audible over the ringing in Mick's ears, "this is just fucking perfect." Mick tried to unbuckle his harness, tried to get to his friend, but his broken arm wouldn't cooperate, and the twisted metal of the vehicle held him in place like a cage. "Hang on, Tommy," he said, though he could hear his own voice sounding strange and distant. "Help's coming, just hang on." But they both knew help wasn't coming fast enough. The rest of their convoy was dealing with their own casualties, and the medics were still minutes away. Minutes that Tommy didn't have. "Mick," Tommy said, and there was something in his voice that made Mick stop struggling against his restraints and listen. "I need you to do something for me. Anything, man. You know that." Tommy's hand moved slowly, painfully, reaching into the cargo pocket of his uniform. He pulled out a small velvet box, the kind that held engagement rings, and held it out toward Mick, with fingers that shook from more than just the cold. "I was going to ask her when we got home," Tommy said. "Had it all planned out. Dinner at that Italian place she likes, then a walk by the lake where we used to go when we were kids. I was going to tell her I loved her, that I wanted to spend the rest of my life making her happy." Mick stared at the ring box, understanding flooding through him like ice water. Tommy had been planning to propose to Sarah Chen, the nurse he'd been dating for 2 years, the woman he'd talked about constantly during their deployment. Sarah, who wrote him letters every week and sent pictures of herself in her scrubs, making silly faces at the camera. Sarah, who Tommy claimed was going to be the mother of his children and the love of his life. "You're going to ask her yourself," Mick said, but the words sounded hollow, even to him. Tommy shook his head, a small movement that seemed to cost him tremendous effort. "Look at me, Mick. Really look at me." Mick looked, and what he saw made his stomach turn. The blood wasn't slowing down. If anything, it was getting worse. Tommy's face was pale, his breathing shallow and rapid. He was going into shock, and without immediate medical attention, he wasn't going to make it. "I need you to promise me something," Tommy said. "I need you to make sure Emma's okay. Make sure she finds someone who can make her happy, someone who can give her the life she deserves. Tommy, promise me, Mick. Promise me you'll make sure she's happy." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of a dying man's last request. Mick wanted to refuse, wanted to tell Tommy he was going to be fine, that he'd proposed to Sarah himself when they got home. But he could see the truth in his friend's eyes, could hear it in the way his breathing was getting more labored with each word. "I promise," Mick said, and took the ring box with his good hand. Tommy smiled, a real smile this time, and closed his eyes. "Tell her I loved her," he whispered. "Tell her I'm sorry I couldn't keep my promise to come home." Those were the last words Thomas Michael Morrison ever spoke. He died there in the wreckage of their Humvee, holding Mick's hand, while the sound of approaching helicopters filled the air with the promise of help that had come too late. The medics had extracted Mick from the wreckage and flown him to a field hospital, where doctors had set his broken arm and stitched up the gash on his forehead and told him he was lucky to be alive. They'd kept him for observation for 3 days, during which time he'd stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out how to keep a promise to a dead man. The ring was still in his pocket when they discharged him. He'd looked at it exactly once, opening the velvet box to reveal a simple solitaire diamond that probably represented 6 months of Tommy's army salary. It was beautiful in its simplicity, the kind of ring a man bought when he was more concerned with the sentiment than the size of the stone. The kind of ring that said, "I love you," instead of "look how much money I have." Mick had closed the box and hadn't opened it since. The army had given him a Purple Heart and a medical discharge and a disability rating that would pay his bills for the rest of his life if he was careful with money. They'd also given him the address of Tommy's next of kin, his parents, who lived in the same house on Elm Street, where he and Mick had grown up, and his sister Emma, who was listed as his emergency contact. Emma, who had been Mick's fiancée when Tommy died, who had held him while he cried at Tommy's funeral, who had tried to understand why he'd come home different and broken and unable to sleep through the night. Emma, who had loved him enough to fight for their relationship, even when he'd been too damaged to fight for it himself. Emma, who deserved better than a man who woke up screaming and couldn't hold a job and jumped every time a car backfired. Breaking up with Emma had been the hardest thing Mick had ever done, but he'd convinced himself it was also the right thing. She was young, beautiful, smart, kind. She could have any man she wanted. She didn't need to waste her life trying to fix someone who might be permanently broken. But Tommy's promise had complicated everything. How do you make sure your ex-fiancée is happy when you're the reason she's unhappy? How do you keep a promise to help someone find love when you're the one who broke their heart? For 3 years, Mick had wrestled with these questions. He'd moved to a small town in Montana, had gotten a job as a park ranger, where he could work alone and didn't have to deal with crowds or loud noises or any of the things that triggered his anxiety. He'd gone to therapy, had taken medication, had done all the things the VA doctors told him to do to manage his PTSD. He'd gotten better, slowly, incrementally, like a bone healing after a bad break, but he'd never forgotten the promise. And he'd never stopped keeping track of Emma, checking her social media from fake accounts, asking mutual friends casual questions about how she was doing. He'd told himself it was just concern for an old friend, but he'd known it was more than that. He'd known he was still in love with her, would probably always be in love with her, and that knowledge was both a comfort and a torture. When he'd heard she was dating someone new, David Walsh, an accountant from Pittsburgh who'd moved to Millbrook to be closer to his aging parents, Mick had felt a mixture of relief and devastation. Relief because it meant she was moving on, was finding the happiness he'd wanted for her. Devastation because it meant she was moving on without him. He'd done some research on David Walsh, the kind of background check that was probably illegal, but that his military training had made second nature. David was clean, no criminal record, no history of violence, no red flags that would suggest he was anything other than what he appeared to be. He had a steady job, a good credit score, and a reputation in his community as a decent, reliable man. He coached Little League Baseball, volunteered at the local animal shelter, and had never been married before, which suggested he wasn't the kind of man who made promises lightly. In other words, David Walsh was everything Mick wasn't. He was the kind of man who could promise Emma a future and actually deliver on that promise. When Mick had heard about the engagement 6 months ago, he'd known it was time. Time to keep the promise he'd made to Tommy, time to make sure Emma was truly happy, time to let go of the last thread that connected him to the life he'd left behind. He'd driven from Montana to Pennsylvania, a journey that had taken him 3 days and felt like 3 years. He'd checked into a motel on the outskirts of Millbrook and had spent a week watching Emma from a distance, trying to gauge whether she was truly happy or just going through the motions. What he'd seen had both broken his heart and healed it at the same time. Emma was happy, really genuinely happy in a way he'd never seen her before. She laughed easily, smiled constantly, and moved through the world with the kind of confidence that came from feeling loved and secure. When she was with David, she glowed. When David looked at her, his face lit up, like she was the answer to every prayer he'd ever prayed. They were good together. They fit in a way that Mick and Emma never had, complementing each other's strengths and covering each other's weaknesses. David was steady where Emma was impulsive, practical where she was dreamy. Emma was adventurous where David was cautious, creative where he was methodical. They balanced each other out, made each other better. Watching them together, Mick had finally understood what Tommy had meant when he'd asked him to make sure Emma was happy. It wasn't about finding her someone to settle for, someone who would do. It was about finding her someone who would love her the way she deserved to be loved, completely and without reservation. David Walsh loved Emma Morrison the way she deserved to be loved, and that was enough to fulfill the promise Mick had made to a dying man in a desert halfway around the world. The wedding ceremony was beautiful, exactly the kind of event Emma had always dreamed of. Mick knew this because he'd been there when she'd planned their wedding, back when they'd been young and stupid and convinced that love could conquer anything. She'd wanted a church wedding with all the traditional elements, the white dress, the flowers, the music, the vows that promised forever. She'd gotten all of that with David, and more. The church was decorated with white roses and baby's breath, the kind of elegant simplicity that spoke of good taste rather than unlimited budget. Emma's dress was stunning, not the elaborate princess gown she'd picked out when she was 20, but something more sophisticated, more mature. It suited the woman she'd become, confident and graceful and radiant with happiness. David looked like a man who couldn't believe his luck, which was exactly how a groom should look. When Emma walked down the aisle on her father's arm, David's face had transformed with an expression of such pure joy that Mick had felt his own eyes fill with tears. The ceremony itself was traditional but personal, with vows that Emma and David had written themselves. Emma spoke about finding love when she'd least expected it, about learning to trust again after having her heart broken, about believing in second chances and new beginnings. David talked about patience, about waiting his whole life for the right person, about knowing from the moment he met Emma that she was the woman he wanted to spend forever with. Neither of them mentioned Mick, which was exactly as it should be. This was their day, their beginning, their promise to each other. The past was the past, and it had no place in their future. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and David kissed his bride, the congregation erupted in applause and cheers. Mick found himself clapping along, genuinely happy for them despite the ache in his chest that felt like a physical wound. As the newly married couple walked back down the aisle, Emma's eyes swept the congregation, acknowledging friends and family with smiles and waves. For just a moment her gaze landed on Mick, and he saw her expression change from joy to shock to something that might have been fear. But then David was pulling her along and the moment passed, and Mick was just another face in a crowd of well-wishers. The reception was held at the Millbrook Country Club, a venue that managed to be elegant without being pretentious. The ballroom was decorated with the same white roses and baby's breath from the church, and round tables covered in white linens filled the space. A small band played jazz standards while guests mingled during cocktail hour, and the atmosphere was one of celebration and joy. Mick hadn't planned to stay for the reception. His plan had been to witness the ceremony, to confirm that Emma was truly happy, and then to disappear back to Montana with the knowledge that he'd kept his promise to Tommy. But something had held him there, some need to see this through to the end. He found a spot at the bar in the corner of the room, where he could observe without being observed. He ordered a beer and watched Emma and David make their rounds, greeting guests and accepting congratulations. They moved together like a team, Emma's natural warmth balancing David's more reserved nature, both of them glowing with happiness. Emma's parents were there, of course, Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, who had aged in the 3 years since Mick had last seen them, but who still radiated the kind of solid middle-class respectability that had made their home a second home to him throughout his childhood. They'd been kind to him after Tommy's death, had included him in their grief and their memories, but he'd pulled away from them along with everyone else when he'd left town. Tommy's absence was a presence in the room, acknowledged but not dwelt upon. There was a small memorial table near the entrance with his photo, Tommy in his dress blues, smiling that cocky grin that had gotten him in and out of trouble his whole life. A single white rose lay beside the photo, and Mick noticed that several guests had stopped to pay their respects throughout the evening. Emma had loved her brother deeply, and Mick knew that Tommy's death had hit her almost as hard as it had hit him. But she'd found a way to move forward, to build a life that honored Tommy's memory without being defined by his loss. It was something Mick was still learning how to do. As the evening progressed, Mick found himself relaxing slightly. The beer helped, but more than that, the atmosphere of genuine happiness was infectious. This wasn't a wedding where people were going through the motions or settling for good enough. This was a celebration of two people who had found something real and rare and worth celebrating. During the dinner, David stood to give a speech that was both heartfelt and humorous, talking about how Emma had changed his life and how grateful he was to have found her. Emma's maid of honor, her college roommate Sarah, gave a speech about Emma's resilience and strength and capacity for love. Mr. Morrison spoke about gaining a son and about how proud he was of the woman Emma had become. No one mentioned the war, or Tommy, or the shadows that had once threatened to consume Emma's happiness. This was a night for looking forward, not back. As the evening wound down and guests began to filter out, Mick knew it was time to leave. He'd seen what he'd come to see, had confirmed what he'd hoped to confirm. Emma was happy, truly happy, with a man who loved her and would take care of her. Tommy's promise had been kept. He was making his way toward the exit when a hand touched his arm. Michael Sullivan. He turned to find Emma standing behind him, still in her wedding dress but with her hair slightly mussed from dancing and her cheeks flushed with champagne and happiness. Up close, she was even more beautiful than she'd been from across the room, and for a moment, Mick forgot how to breathe. "Emma," he said, and her name felt strange on his tongue after 3 years of not saying it out loud. "Congratulations. You look beautiful. What are you doing here?" she asked, and there was no anger in her voice, just curiosity and something that might have been concern. Mick looked around the ballroom, at the remnants of her perfect wedding, at the life she'd built without him. "I wanted to make sure you were happy," he said simply. Emma's expression softened. "Mick, you are," he said quickly, before she could say whatever she was going to say. "Happy, I mean. I can see it. And David's a good man. He loves you the way you deserve to be loved." "Yes," Emma said quietly. "He does." They stood there for a moment, two people who had once meant everything to each other, now separated by years and choices and the weight of everything that had happened between them. "I'm sorry," Mick said finally, "for how I ended things, for hurting you. You deserved better than that." Emma was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. "You were hurting too," she said finally. "I understand that now in a way I didn't then. You were trying to protect me. I was trying to protect you from me." "I know." She reached out and touched his hand, a brief contact that sent electricity up his arm. Are you okay now? Are you happy?" It was a complicated question with a complicated answer. Was he happy? He was better than he'd been, healthier, more at peace with himself and his choices. He'd found a way to live with his demons, to function in the world, to build something resembling a normal life. But happy, that was harder to define. "I'm getting there," he said, which was as honest as he could be. Emma nodded like she understood. "I'm glad. You deserve to be happy too, Mick. You deserve to find someone who can love you the way you are, scars and all. Maybe someday," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "Emma?" David appeared at her side, looking slightly concerned. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," Emma said, slipping her hand into her husband's. "David, this is Michael Sullivan. We used to know each other." David extended his hand, and Mick shook it, noting the firm grip and the direct eye contact. "Nice to meet you, Michael. Thanks for coming to celebrate with us." "Congratulations," Mick said. "You're a lucky man." "I know," David said, and the simple sincerity of his response made Mick like him even more. "We should probably get going," Emma said. "Early flight tomorrow for the honeymoon." "Where are you going?" Mick asked. "Italy," David said, his face lighting up. "Emma's always wanted to see Rome." Mick remembered. Emma had talked about Italy constantly when they were together, had dreamed of seeing the Colosseum and the Vatican and all the places she'd read about in books. It was one of the many dreams he'd never been able to give her. "That sounds perfect," he said. Emma looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her trying to find the right words for goodbye. Finally, she stood on her tiptoes and kissed his cheek, a brief, soft contact that felt like forgiveness. "Take care of yourself, Mick," she whispered. "You too," he said. "Be happy, Emma. That's all I ever wanted for you." She smiled, the same smile that had lit up his world when they were young, and then she was gone, walking away with her husband toward their future together. Mick stood there for a moment, watching them go, feeling something shift inside his chest. It wasn't closure exactly. He wasn't sure he'd ever have complete closure when it came to Emma Morrison, but it was something like peace, the knowledge that he'd done the right thing, that the promise he'd made to Tommy had been kept. The drive back to Montana took Mick 3 days, the same as the drive east had taken him. But this time the journey felt different, lighter somehow, as if he'd left something heavy behind in that ballroom in Pennsylvania. He stopped at a diner in Ohio for breakfast on the second day, the same kind of small-town place he'd eaten at 100 times during his years of wandering. The waitress was friendly, the coffee was strong, and the eggs were cooked exactly the way he'd ordered them. It was the kind of ordinary moment that he'd learned to appreciate, the kind of simple pleasure that made life worth living. As he sat in his booth watching the morning traffic pass by outside the window, Mick pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. He'd been carrying it around for 6 months, ever since his therapist had suggested he might be ready to try dating again. Her name was Lisa, and she was a teacher at the elementary school in the town where he worked. She was divorced, had 2 kids, and had made it clear through mutual friends that she was interested in getting to know him better. She was nothing like Emma, blonde where Emma was brunette, quiet where Emma was outgoing, practical where Emma was dreamy. But she was kind, and she was patient, and she seemed to understand that some people came with more baggage than others. Mick had been too afraid to call her, too convinced that he had nothing to offer anyone, too certain that his damage was permanent and irreparable. But sitting in that diner, with the knowledge that Emma was happy and that Tommy's promise had been kept, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt ready to try. He dialed Lisa's number before he could change his mind. "Hello?" Her voice was warm, slightly surprised. "Hi, Lisa. It's Mick Sullivan, from the Park Service." "Mick, hi. I was wondering if I'd ever hear from you. I know it's been a while. I've been working through some things, but I was wondering if you'd like to have dinner sometime, when I get back to town." There was a pause, and for a moment, Mick thought she was going to say no. But then she laughed, a sound that was nothing like Emma's laugh, but that was pleasant in its own way. "I'd like that," she said. "I'd like that very much." They talked for a few more minutes, making plans for the following weekend, and when Mick hung up, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not happiness exactly, but the possibility of happiness. The sense that maybe, just maybe, he was ready to stop running from his life and start living it instead. The rest of the drive passed in a blur of highways and truck stops and small towns that looked like every other small town in America. But when Mick finally pulled into his driveway in Montana, when he walked into his small house and set his keys on the kitchen counter, it felt different than it had when he'd left. It felt like home. That night, he sat on his back porch with a beer and looked up at the stars. The same stars that were shining down on Emma and David in Italy, the same stars that had shone down on him and Tommy in Iraq all those years ago. The night was quiet except for the sound of wind in the trees and the distant call of an owl. And for the first time in 3 years, Mick felt at peace. He thought about Tommy, about the promise he'd made, and the promise he'd kept. He thought about Emma, radiant in her wedding dress, dancing with a man who loved her completely. He thought about Lisa, and the possibility of building something new from the pieces of his broken life. And he thought about the future, which for the first time in years felt like something to look forward to instead of something to endure. The promise had been kept. Emma was happy. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for Mick to be happy too. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in September, exactly 1 year after Emma's wedding. Mick found it in his mailbox when he got home from work, mixed in with the usual collection of bills and advertisements and catalogues he'd never ordered. The return address was familiar, Mr. and Mrs. David Walsh, Millbrook, Pennsylvania. Inside was a birth announcement printed on cream-colored cardstock with elegant script lettering. Thomas Michael Walsh, it read. Born September 15th, 7 pounds 3 ounces. Parents, Emma and David Walsh. There was a photo tucked inside the announcement, a tiny, red-faced baby with a shock of dark hair and eyes that were still the unfocused blue of all newborns. On the back of the photo, someone had written in Emma's familiar handwriting, "Thank you for keeping your promise. Tommy would be so proud." Mick stared at the photo for a long time, at this new life that carried his best friend's name, this continuation of a story that had seemed to end in the desert of Iraq 3 years ago. The baby looked like all babies looked, wrinkled and slightly alien and absolutely perfect. But there was something in his expression, even in sleep, that reminded Mick of his namesake. He propped the photo up on his kitchen counter, next to a picture of him and Lisa that had been taken at the county fair the month before. They'd been dating for almost a year now, taking things slow, building something solid and real from the foundation of mutual respect and understanding. It wasn't the passionate, all-consuming love he'd shared with Emma, but it was something deeper, more sustainable. It was the kind of love that could weather storms and grow stronger over time. Lisa understood about his past, about the war and the nightmares, and the reasons he sometimes needed space. She didn't try to fix him or change him, just accepted him as he was, and loved him anyway. Her kids, Jake 8 and Molly 6, had adopted him as a sort of honorary stepfather, and he'd discovered that he had a talent for bedtime stories and Saturday morning pancakes and all the small rituals of family life. They were talking about getting married, he and Lisa, not rushing into it, but planning for it, building toward it the way you build toward anything worthwhile, carefully, deliberately, with full awareness of what you're committing to. It was a different kind of love than what he'd had with Emma, but it was no less real for being different. And maybe that was the point. Maybe there wasn't just one person for everyone, one perfect match that would complete you and make everything right. Maybe there were different kinds of love for different seasons of your life, and the trick was recognizing them when they came, and being brave enough to reach for them. That evening, Mick called the number on the birth announcement. Emma answered on the 3rd ring, her voice tired but happy. "Mick? Oh my God, I can't believe you called. Did you get the announcement?" "I did. Congratulations. He's beautiful. Thank you. And thank you for everything. For being there. For understanding, for letting me go when I needed to be let go. Thank you for naming him Tommy." Emma was quiet for a moment. "It felt right," she said finally. "David suggested it, actually. He said Tommy was obviously an important person in our lives, and that this was a way to honor his memory. David's a good man. He is. And Mick, I heard through the grapevine that you're seeing someone. Lisa Patterson? Yeah, it's good, really good. I'm so glad. You deserve to be happy, Mick. You deserve to have someone who sees all the good in you that the rest of us have always seen." After they hung up, Mick sat on his porch again, looking up at the stars and thinking about promises and second chances, and the strange ways that life could surprise you. Tommy was gone, would always be gone. But his memory lived on in the baby who bore his name, in the friendship that had shaped two young men's lives, in the promise that had brought Mick full circle from despair to something like hope. The promise had been kept. Emma was happy. And for the first time in years, so was he. In the distance, he could hear Lisa's car pulling into the driveway, could hear Jake and Molly arguing about something in the back seat, could hear the sounds of the life he was building, one day at a time, one choice at a time. He stood up to meet them, to help carry in groceries and homework and all the beautiful ordinary chaos of a family coming home. The stars wheeled overhead, constant and eternal, watching over all of them. The living and the dead, the broken and the healing, the promises kept and the promises yet to be made. And in that moment, Michael Sullivan understood what Tommy had really been asking him to do in that wrecked Humvee in Baghdad. Not just to make sure Emma was happy, but to make sure he was happy too, to find a way to live, not just survive, to build something beautiful from the wreckage of war and loss and all the things that couldn't be undone. The promise had been kept, the circle was complete, and the future, for all of them, was just beginning.